Thank you very much indeed, and well done to you for staying awake and getting to the very end. I talked earlier about a book that was published over a decade ago. I'm now going to talk about a book that has not been published. It's going to appear in September with Yale University Press, and for reasons I don't understand, it also comes out with a company called Norton, who actually have asked to change the subtitle. So it'll have this cover, but the subtitle, and this doesn't seem to have any relevance, unlike the subtitles of the British version of my last book, is simply Crisis, Revolution, and America's Early Independence. I think somehow they think that'll be of more interest to the reader rather than British imperial crisis. Regardless, this is really a book, and it's co-authored, about how to think about the American Revolution. It's a book of ideas, and I wrote it with the late Trevor Bernard, who very tragically, and he was my junior, passed away last April, having completed every part of his side of the book, and we'd actually submitted the final version. I really only had to go through the proofs and apply for the picture rights afterwards. He liked to say in the pitch that part of the attraction of the book was that we were both outsiders to the United States. We'd both been born abroad. He was a New Zealander, and I was born in England. He was celebrated just at the beginning of this week. We had a conference at London University, a 2-day conference at the Senate House. He'd become really Britain's leading historian of Jamaica, which is how we first met. My first book was on the Caribbean. And also an advocate of what's known as Atlantic history, of not just national histories, but looking much more broadly to the history of the Americas and the British outside of America. When he passed away, there was an entire half-page obituary to him in the Guardian. He'd been head of history at Warwick, head of history at the University of Melbourne, and also director of the Wilberforce Institute at Hull. And he was responsible for conducting the inquiry for the Guardian into the history of their connections with slavery. Another project he completed. He was remarkably industrious. It happened that another British-born Jamaican scholar at Oxford, when I say Jamaican, I mean a scholar of Jamaica, passed away in his early 30s, and he completed a book manuscript. And Trevor, in the last months of his life, managed to finish off that book manuscript for him and to publish it. A very generous scholar. I like to say that this book is Hamlet without the prince. It's all about the American Revolution, but we don't have a great deal about America. There are none of the traditional events of the American Revolution, like the Boston Tea Party. This instead is looking at the American Revolution from the perspective of all the other British colonies in the world, the colonies that did not rebel. And when I did my early book on the Caribbean, I reminded people that there were 13 other colonies just in the Caribbean. That's not in North America. Places like Nova Scotia, Quebec, Montreal, Jamaica, Barbados. So that actually the 13 colonies were only half the colonies in North America, and there were many more abroad, India, Obviously, although largely northern India and Bengal in this period, Ireland is frequently treated in the literature as a colony. And so we're looking at their perspective. And the argument of this book is that we can learn a lot about the American Revolution and get a lot of novel insights by looking at these colonies that don't rebel. And I'm going to just show you a brief summary of what we think we can teach people about the American Revolution by this unusual approach, essentially a British approach, looking at it from a British perspective that is rarely done. Well, one that you heard about this morning, but to which I have had additional thoughts since writing the book the last decade, is the reasons for Britain's defeat, and I'll come on to that again in a moment. Another is understanding the British policies towards America. They often look very disjointed when you look at them just in terms of America. If you look at them in terms of the larger empire, you can see exactly what Britain was attempting to achieve before 1776. Another that I mentioned in my very first book, but I didn't give any examples, I said by looking at the colonies that don't rebel, you can actually debate and prioritize the reasons why the American colonies rebelled. And you can intervene in the historiography and long-running debate about the origins of the Revolutionary War. My colleague was particularly keen, as a leading historian of slavery, to use this to point out the central importance of slavery, indigenous people, and settler colonialism during the period of the Revolution. He reminds us, for example, that much of North America, and indeed the southern continent, was still peopled by indigenous peoples at this point of their history. And then finally, we were very keen to talk about the impact on the British Empire. And Andrew spoke earlier about the impact on naval thought, and that's exactly the kind of thing. What effect does it have on the future governing of the empire? What effect did it have on the military, this loss of a huge chunk of the empire, for which George III's reign would always be remembered, even though by the time George III died, the empire was larger than it had ever been without America. So surprisingly, this has not really been attempted before. It's what I call an imperial history of the American Revolution. And there used to be what was called the Imperial School of American Historians for the first half of the 20th century, beginning with someone called Charles Andrews, one of America's first professional historians. And it went right through to the 1960s with this man, Lawrence Henry Gibson, who did a 10-volume series called The British Empire and the Coming of the American Revolution. And even its critics said it's been the most fruitful approach to American history. It meant that it also involved the study of the British Caribbean, which is how I got interested in it. But surprisingly, they stopped in 1776. So it's just for the colonial period. So Lawrence Henry Gibson's volumes end in 1776. They're slightly disappointing because what he does is to write the histories of all these colonies simultaneously, but he doesn't compare them, and he doesn't really come to conclusions. There's a sort of lack of analysis. There's incredible work in terms of pure information. But when I read it, I was expecting him to have a big section at the end saying why the British Empire, why the British Caribbean remained loyal when the other 13 colonies rebelled. And he had about one paragraph on that, which was later really, I did a whole book on that subject. There is, though, one exception, a professor at Oxford called Reginald Koopman, who did a book in 1930, The American Revolution and the British Empire. And it's got some very good material in it. He was particularly an expert on Canada and the Quebec Act. But like a lot of historians to this day, although some people imagine it is only today, there's often a political agenda behind some of these books. And in his case, he wanted to promote what was called Dominion government, where basically the predominantly white settler colonies became almost self-governing and independent. Places like Canada and New Zealand, these would enjoy in future a great deal of independence. And he wanted to show that this had a long historical trajectory going back to the Quebec Act of 1774. So we really do think we were the first to do a history, an imperial history of the revolution, and to argue that it has great benefits. So one of the themes I mentioned, and I'll just talk and give a few examples for each of the themes that I mentioned, was that it really, it's when you look at the war in an imperial context, you understand it much better. Indeed, to really understand the Revolutionary War, you need to look at it from the British perspective, because the American theatres were only a small part of the theatres of the Revolutionary War. But my thinking was modified after I did my book, The Men Who Lost America, when I held a conference largely to celebrate the arrival of a reproduction French ship called the Hermione to America, which was the ship in which the Marquis de Lafayette had sailed to America. We held the conference at Mount Vernon, and it struck me as I listened to the papers that the foreign support that America received from France, and more indirectly from the Dutch and the Spanish, had been critical to their success. And that this foreign support began before they actually entered the war. So even for the first half of the war, while supposedly the colonies are fighting alone, they're receiving gunpowder, they're receiving ammunition and supplies, even uniforms and food, and critically money from other Europeans. Someone today, I think perhaps it was Jeremy, talked about saltpeter. That's so necessary for the making of gunpowder. Maybe it was you, Andrew, sorry. And the Americans didn't produce it at all. Of course, you said the best place was India, which I hadn't heard. But the Americans didn't produce any of it, and they had no source of it within their borders. And they were getting it largely from the Dutch and French through the Caribbean. Initially, places like Martinique, and later, once France joined the war, through a Dutch island, a tiny Dutch island called San Eustatius, which was the first foreign place to salute the American flag. And although it's a tiny place, many of America's supplies and equipment were coming through this island. And the fact is that the British were fighting 5 different powers simultaneously after 1779. So I mentioned France, Spain, and the Dutch, but they were also fighting the Maratha Empire in India, and most of the rest of Europe basically allied against the British in what they called the League of Armed Neutrality in 1780. And it could be argued that this was one of the only wars in British history where the British fought alone. Generally, the British have won their wars with allies. The British have won their wars with allies. The 7 Years' War, famously, Pitt paid Frederick the Great of Prussia to fight the French in Europe. And he said, let us win America in Germany. So keeping the French busy in Europe, while the British concentrated their forces in Canada and New England, was part of the strategy. I call the chapter on warfare the War of Empires. And I think you could argue that this was much more of an imperial war even than the 7 Years' War. Because in the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 63, that was, a large part was fought in Europe, even though there was a large imperial dimension. During the American Revolution, very little of the fighting was in Europe, although clearly some of the naval battles in the Channel and so on and Mediterranean can count as European, but in terms of major landed operations within Europe, there was very little of it. And I've said that looking at this war from the British point of view helps you see much more clearly why they lost. And I'm going to argue that foreign support was very critical, not only in this, but in all of these, what I call counter-insurgency wars, these situations where smaller powers defeat major powers. And there's almost an unknown debate, historiographical debate, by two of the great military historians of the Revolution. And it's almost underground because they were both friends, they were both ex-officers, they both came from families with army traditions, and it was a very friendly debate, but they disagreed fundamentally with each other. One of them was John Shai, who taught most of his life at the University of Michigan, and who had gone to West Point and graduated out of West Point and had served in Vietnam and was haunted by Vietnam. Jeremy said earlier he thought his comparisons to Vietnam nonsense, but he didn't fully give his reasons why. But basically, John Shai thought that the Revolutionary War was Britain's Vietnam, and he saw a lot of parallels, even in the way that patriots were militarized by their service in the militia. It reminded him a lot of the militarization of people in southern Vietnam serving in the Viet Cong. But he was opposed by this British historian at Oxford, Piers Mackesy, who'd come from several generations of British historians. And Mackesy argued, no, the American Revolution was winnable. He wrote, I think, the Bible of the British side of the American Revolution. It's called The War for America. And it describes comprehensively every battle and every theater of the war. And I've read it, I think, at least 3 times. It's a very dense, well over 500 pages. And I really didn't fully understand his thesis when I read it. It seemed to me what he'd illustrated was that the British were just overextended. And all these maps and all this data convinced me of that fact, which is certainly part of his argument. But what he really believed and what he pushed is that the war was lost by incompetent commanders, military commanders, and he absolved the politicians from any responsibility. One of the books he wrote was a biography of Lord George Germain called The Coward of Minden, which is, as some would say, his greatest book, in which he again tries to absolve Germain of any real responsibility at the Battle of Minden, and argues that this was just a political trial and that he'd been a very brave and good soldier. And when War for America was reprinted in the 90s, John Shy wrote a foreword to it. And I was very surprised reading the foreword because it contained what I regarded as gossip from my time at Oxford. It said, Mackessy's family, and Mackessy was still alive, were haunted by the fact that Churchill had made him responsible and the scapegoat for the failure of the Norway campaign at the beginning of the Second World War, in which the British were thinking of a Normandy-style beachhead into Norway. And Mackessy's father took the decision, rather like Germain at Minden, of not to attack, and saw perils and dangers and desisted and broke orders. But Mackessy was then essentially shamed. Afterwards, his father, the family would have actually been in penury, but for the fact that his mother was a good writer and novelist and basically kept them afloat. But for a family of several generations in the military, it was shocking and embarrassing. And Mackessy's books were nearly all about trying to change blame. And they're obsessed with leaderships and leaders being blamed. And what Shy, by putting this story in, was gently suggesting was that Mackessy was too obsessed with the leadership and not seeing the underlying causes. I'm obviously, from what you heard this morning, very much more on John Shy's side. He said, he was a real admirer of War for America, but he said he sets it up like the Second World War with all these theatres. And he said it's not like the Second World War. Well, Mackessy came back with a little essay that's very difficult to get. Literally, it's a typescript of a lecture he gave in New England in 1976 at Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts. And it's called, Could the British Have Won the War of Independence? I don't know if Jeremy was inspired by that title earlier. And it's much shorter, and the argument of Mackessy is much clearer. And he said, yes, we could. And he replied to John Shy and said that these kinds of counterinsurgencies can be won. And the British had a potentially winning strategy with which he credited Germain, even for the latter part of the war, of using loyalist militias, using your supporters in America, in combination with your army to keep down the majority of the population and to make up for the small numbers of the British army. And he quoted a conflict which is regularly quoted, most recently by General Petraeus and Andrew Roberts, as an example of how these conflicts can be won. And that is the British war in what was then Malaysia, from the late 1940s to the end of the 50s. And this I can remember even as a child. People would compare us favorably to the Americans in Vietnam and say we had the same situation in Malaya and won, unlike the Americans. And the idea was we had just had better know-how and more sophistication. So I've done a lot of reading about counterinsurgency and about Malaya, especially since writing my former book. And what came over very quickly is that actually we've been defeated in most of our counterinsurgency warfare. Things didn't go that well in Iraq or Afghanistan for the British Army. Malaya was the outlier. But what was unusual about Malaya is, firstly, they had no foreign support. And secondly, it was just a Chinese ethnic population within Malaya. They didn't have a great deal of support from the local population. Nevertheless, it took 4 or so years to be defeated. They had to use what today would probably be considered as excessive means, not unlike those they were using against the Maori in Nigeria. And only then was it won. And what this highlighted to me was how important foreign support is, and that I can hardly think of many revolutions that have not been won without foreign support. One example would be Haiti. I was saying earlier that you can't formulate rules in history. There are certain guidelines, certain parallels. Haiti, but for very specific reasons, managed to rebel successfully to defeat France without any allies, but it's one of the very few. Ireland is an example of counterinsurgency, and that, if I'd been Mackesy, I would have quoted Ireland. But that's because the British were willing to stake any amount of their resources. They had a third of their peacetime army in Ireland. They had more fortresses in Ireland than any other part of Europe, other than France, and probably, I would think, Potsdam and some of Prussia's fortifications. And even so, there were very near moments, like the Irish Rebellion of 1798. And when the British finally did get out in the 1920s, they'd not been defeated in the traditional sense any more than they were in America. The decision was reached. This was just too costly and involved too many resources to stay. And of course, if you think of current conflicts like Ukraine, you can see why it's so important to get foreign help. I was saying earlier to Andrew that there's not been a lot of work on the funding of the American army by France and Spain. But the help given by France bankrupted France and helped lead to the French Revolution. It was very significant, and without it, America could have collapsed. This is why Washington was so terrified, and this was why there was a danger that even towards the time of the Battle of Yorktown, the Americans still might be defeated, because the French and Spanish were thinking of getting out. And without French and Spanish support, it might not have ended in a complete British victory, but there are lots of other scenarios, like a British presence in the southern states of America. So I just wanted to give a few pictures we've included of this as a worldwide war. This is Horatio Nelson, one of the earliest paintings of him in the St. John River in Nicaragua. Almost totally unknown conflict, but 3,000 British troops were sent there. More British troops were being poured into the Caribbean at the time of the second half of the Revolutionary War than into North America. And they were going to places like Belize, where Lord Derby is served, and to Nicaragua. And they had this incredible idea that they were going to take South America and encourage slave rebellions and Native American rebellions, and essentially swap what they'd lost in the North for the South. Unfortunately, disease took its hand. In the middle of the American Revolution, Ireland blew up. there was the volunteer movement, and what began with Northern Irish Protestants, but it later included Catholics and Southern Irish Protestants, incidentally, was they said that the removal of British troops had left them dangerously unguarded from France and Spain. And so they armed themselves. Some 60,000 of them were ultimately armed, but it was somewhat ambiguous whether they were armed for defence or to attack the British government. And I might tell you, once they'd assembled this army, this is in the centre of Dublin, once they'd assembled it, they managed to gain incredible concessions out of Britain, including ultimately the independence of the Irish Parliament. We've talked about the Battle of the Saints and Rodney and the defeat of de Grasse. And Rodney was often portrayed as St. George and the Dragon. This is the monument that I mentioned in Spanish town, Jamaica. And these are some of the commemorative items that appeared. Someone said they've got a pub near them called the Rodney. And certainly before Howe and Nelson, who's a popular figure, a lot of ships were named after him. So I will just briefly summarize the other themes in this book. And one of them is the way we can better understand British policy before the American Revolution. This is a book by a friend of mine who was at this conference earlier this week, Patrick Griffin. It's called The Townsend Moment. It's about the two Townsend brothers. Charles Townsend, who was responsible for the second great effort to tax America in 1767, and his brother, Viscount George Townsend, who was Lord Lieutenant for Ireland. And what Patrick was pointing out in that book is that they were simultaneously enforcing very similar policies in Ireland and America. And in fact, if you then look at India and other parts of the world, including the Caribbean, you can see this even more clearly, that the British had an agenda. A lot of these policies were disjointed. Some were in response to influence groups and lobbies. They wanted to quarter troops in American towns because during the 7 Years' War, the army had been furious at not being able to quarter troops and having problems as to how to house its soldiers. They never did try to quarter soldiers on civilians. That's one of the big myths of the American Revolution. So when they talked about quartering, it was quartering them in unused town buildings, and the British Army having the right to essentially take over those buildings. The attempt to try and reduce paper notes and currency in America, that was at the behest of merchants who were fed up being paid in money that was worth a lot less than the value of the goods. So all of that was true. But there are really four major themes that you can see emerging. One is a desire to reform the British Empire. Another was to improve the administration and efficiency of administration. A third was to derive a revenue from the British Empire. And a fourth was to better defend the British Empire. In some ways, the governing of the empire had been very lackadaisical. There'd been very little direct intervention from Britain. And the weakness of this was becoming very apparent, especially with the 7 Years' War. With the 7 Years' War, Britain acquired two huge alien populations. One was in Bengal, which would later lead to Britain having a fifth of the world's population under its control. And the other was in Canada with the French population of Canada. And clearly they couldn't just leave the status quo, or what had been called salutary neglect. They had to think of a way of absorbing Hindus in India and French Canadians. They'd never previously, it had always been a trading empire, not a big settlement territorial empire. They had to think of ways of absorbing them, which meant coming up with new policies. What is also clear when you look at this from the perspective of the rest of the empire is that they'd been planning this for a long time, even before the 7 Years' War. There were constant memos, proposals that had gone through for the better governing of the empire. This was something that was building up. This is just a reminder, these are the 13 colonies. That's the rest of the British Empire at the time of the American Revolution. Australia was added soon afterwards. This is what New France looked like, and some of the area acquired as a result of the 7 Years' War. The British Caribbean, which was part of the North American Empire. So by looking at the empire as a whole, we can see that there's a very similar broad set of policies, that they were doing what the French and Spanish were doing as well, which was trying to improve the governing of their empires, trying to derive more of a profit from their empires. And one of the features that emerges when you compare across the board is that they're using Parliament more and more. But this is true of everything that's going on in Britain in the 18th century. Increasingly, they use legislation and Parliament rather than royal prerogative and other methods to introduce new policies. This is when Parliament is really coming in to its own. And it was, of course, part of the almost biblical belief at the time that Parliament was absolutely supreme. It could do whatever it wanted in America, and it could govern. But this was basically a new claim, that Parliament could do what it wanted in America. That had always been accepted in Britain. But Parliament didn't even tax Ireland, despite the fact that there was something called the Declaratory Act in Ireland that said the British Parliament had absolute rights in all cases whatsoever to govern Ireland, but they'd never tried to tax Ireland, and yet they did it to America. And what becomes very clear if you compare all these colonies is that although they were making policies across the empire and using Parliament a lot in India, they were making many more policies for America. They were really making an example of America. And part of that was the fear that America was going to become independent and that it had been allowed to break away too much. And I also raise, in this particular section, I raise the question, was America tyrannically governed in 1776? After all, the Declaration of Independence claims there was a state of tyranny. That was very important in terms of giving a reason to rebel. And really, in terms of what we today would think of as tyranny, the answer would probably be no. The British soldiers shot some townspeople at the Boston Massacre, but the British soldiers were then taken and put on trial. 2 of them were branded and with their officers sent back to England. So there was not a collapse of the idea of the rule of law in America. Indeed, what is surprising in some ways is the restraint they show to these crowds and to the violence inflicted on people who were just performing their jobs and enacting the law. But what I think you can argue is that Americans were justly fearful of what I would call the potential for tyranny, that once the precedent had been established for Britain taxing America without going through the assemblies of America, they could have raised any amount of money. So the amount of money from the Stamp Act, tea duties, was very small, but it could have been much greater at a later date. All they had to do was establish a precedent. And it's worth remembering that every European country had had legislative bodies like Parliament at one time. Places where the monarchs had to go to raise money. But in the case of every other state, the monarchs had found a way to raise money without appealing to what was sometimes called parliaments or the States General. Remember, at the beginning of the French Revolution, they'd not called the Estates General in many years. And so the potential for tyranny was really there. And that's useful because the original imperial school of historians basically said the American Revolution was about nothing and that they didn't have a particularly good grounds. It was a power grab, as the British complained. But this latent danger of tyranny is very helpful. So I mentioned too, the book is about the impact of the American Revolution on the rest of the empire. What effect does it have? What lessons do the British learn? One of the immediate consequences is having to deal with Americans who'd supported the British side. Like nearly every revolution, it was also a civil war. And about a third of Americans had supported the British during that war. And the British had a great conscience about what happened to these people. And some of them, I would say the majority, actually stayed in America and just disappeared and managed to find ways to re-enter society or to go unnoticed. But a huge proportion of Americans left America, a higher proportion left America than left France during the French Revolution. And they went to Canada predominantly. Much of what is now English-speaking Canada are in fact Americans who transplanted. And even with them transplanted, the French still remained in a majority. One of the shocks of editing our book together of the 14th Earl is that Canada, even in 1824-25, the French were an incredibly significant proportion of the population in regard to Upper Canada, and there was rivalry between the two. This was one of the first occasions where British government really tried to reimburse people. So what you're seeing here is a painting depicting the Loyalists and the Chief Commissioner of Loyalists, essentially refunds. We have these huge books showing who was able to obtain back money for estates that had been simply sequestered by the Patriots. Here's the illustration of Loyalists in Canada in one of their encampments. Maya Jasanoff did a very good book called Liberty's Exiles. She's at Harvard, which is about these various loyalists in different parts of the world. She's particularly good at finding stories and telling them as a series of stories. And she argues that there is also, we talk about the spirit of 1776 and the Patriots, there's also a spirit of 1783 in which these loyalists go out to the rest of the empire and transform it. I have a problem with that because the Loyalists don't go everywhere. They basically are concentrated in Canada and the Bahama Islands, but they're in very small numbers elsewhere. So we're making an alternative proposal in this book that the people who really transformed the empire after the revolution have a major impact are ex-British Army and naval officers who become the governors of these colonies and take with them the experience of their time in America. This is a guy called Major John Simcoe, who had been in command of a Loyalist regiment in the South. He was the kind of opposite number of Bannister Tarleton. And he wrote his own memoirs like Bannister Tarleton. And he doesn't say Tarleton was a war criminal, but he argues, without mentioning him by name, but he was the only person it could be, that he allowed his troops to too much indiscipline and didn't rein them in enough, because the killing in the South was the worst, and the worst was Americans killing other Americans. So Simcoe had been in charge of a regiment of Americans loyal to Britain, so had Bannister Tarleton. But Simcoe became commander of Upper Canada. Canada was not consolidated into one country for a long time. In fact, Nova Scotia, not until the 20th century did it become part of the nation of Canada. But Simcoe was violently anti-American, also very authoritarian. And you imagine that the lesson the British might have learned was to be a lot more tolerant, easygoing, and permit much more self-rule. It was actually the opposite. The new empire was more authoritarian. It would relax later, especially in the predominantly white settler colonies of New Zealand, Australia, and so forth. But in the immediate aftermath, another soldier who really has great influence both in Ireland and India is Cornwallis. And Cornwallis does become something of a hero in Britain. He's the ultimate government man who can be relied on as a safe pair of hands. Cornwallis always insisted that he not only have civilian rule, but he have military rank as well, and could combine both the military and civilian government. And Cornwallis said the problem in America was that the British had come to rely on the local elites too much, had given them too much experience of self-government, and we mustn't do that in India. And Cornwallis essentially segregated the Indian government. Up until the end of the 18th century, a lot of Indians, elite Indians, were involved in the government of the different states within India. It was a sort of partnership. Intermarriage between Indians and the British had been very common. Some of you might know a book called White Moguls that talks about this very free-floating world. All of that changed under Cornwallis. There's an amazing letter from Arthur Lee, who was an American diplomat during the American Revolution, to Cornwallis, really trying to, because Cornwallis was known for his liberal opinions, especially towards America. He never felt the British were right to embark on the policies they did. But he wrote to Cornwallis saying, what about encouraging independence in India and a movement to self-government? And Cornwallis wrote back saying, Hindus will not be ready for self-government for many, many years. I'm sort of giving the idea of a century. These two pictures are part of Cornwallis's victory in the South, in which he really expands the scope of India. He defeated Tipu Sultan and the Maratha Empire, really defeated France's hopes in India. And as part of that defeat, he took he basically took prisoner Tipu Sultan's two sons, a surety that Sultan would meet his side of their agreement. So by the end of George III's reign, although we think of it as the reign in which the British Empire lost America, the empire was larger than it had ever been and was 1/5 of the world's population. And it would continue to expand to the interwar period when it was at its largest with the mandated territories. And I think, as Andrew's been saying, as Jeremy's been saying, it was not by any means a foregone conclusion that it would end. There's an excellent book by a Virginian sociologist called Five Empires, Krishnan and Kumar, who I know well. He's at the University of Virginia, in which he's making that very point, that we take for granted that empires would disappear, nation states reappear. And he points out that Russia is still with us as an empire, so is China. We tend to always think empires are Western European things. That even something like the Ottoman Empire might have gone on for much longer than it did. Thank you.